You think Game of Thrones was twisted? Reality makes it look like Saturday morning cartoons, because buried in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia is the legend of Semiramis, a queen so powerful, so feared, and so sexually voracious that ancient writers claimed she would sleep with 100 men in a single night, and when dawn broke, every single one of them was executed. Yes, a queen who turned her bedchamber into both a pleasure palace and a slaughterhouse. But here's the twist. Semiramis wasn't just some forgotten myth. She's been called the founder of Babylon, the mother of harlots, and even linked to biblical condemnations of empire. Her name became shorthand for dangerous female power. So was she a real ruler who bent empires to her will, or a misogynistic smear campaign turned legend? Tonight, we descend into the 7 levels of Semiramis's myth, from the glamorous lies to the humiliating rituals to the grotesque violence that makes even today's scandals look tame. And trust me, every level will leave you asking, did that actually happen? Because if history is written by the victors, then this story is written by the terrified. She is a ghost who refuses to die. Whisper her name, and you're not just invoking a queen, you're summoning a legend so dangerous that even 2,000 years later, priests were still warning congregations about her. Semiramis, a name drenched in silk, power, and blood. Most people today have never heard of her. If they do, it's usually in passing, a half-forgotten reference to some mythical Babylonian temptress, the whore of empires. And that silence? That's the first clue. History does not simply forget someone who allegedly built one of the world's greatest cities, commanded armies, seduced kings, and rewrote the rules of empire. No, Semiramis was not erased by accident. She was buried under centuries of fear, misogyny, and deliberate character assassination. Ancient sources describe her as the wife, or perhaps the widow, of King Ninus, the supposed founder of Nineveh. Together they ruled Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And yet, when Ninus supposedly died, it was Semiramis who emerged as the true power. She didn't just survive widowhood, she thrived in it. She allegedly donned the robes of kingship, rallied soldiers to her banner, and began to govern in her own right. This was unthinkable in a world where women were property, not rulers. The chroniclers couldn't handle it, so they twisted her into something else, something monstrous. Instead of remembering her as a commander, they remembered her as a seductress. Instead of praising her statecraft, they accused her of witchcraft. And instead of recording her actual deeds, they laced her story with venomous symbols, sex, treachery, and death. To some, she was the Mesopotamian Cleopatra, another queen whose intelligence was conveniently rewritten as lust. To others, she was worse, the mother of all corruption, the original femme fatale who supposedly founded Babylon, the sin city of the ancient world. And here's the bitter irony. Babylon wasn't even hers. Archaeology shows the walls of Babylon were built centuries later, under Nebuchadnezzar. But the legend clung to her anyway, because what better way to brand a woman as evil than to make her the mother of the most infamous city in human memory? Babylon in the Bible becomes the symbol of decadence and doom. And who do they say gave birth to it? Semiramis. She is both everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere, in the myths, whispers, and condemnations, yet nowhere in the actual record of rulers. A queen turned into a myth so scandalous that historians still debate whether she even existed at all. Was she an embellished version of an Assyrian queen like Semiramis, who briefly ruled as regent in the 9th century BCE? Or was she entirely invented by Greek storytellers looking for a villainess to embody Eastern excess? The truth is lost. What survives is the mask. A queen painted in venom, remembered less for what she built and more for the dangers she represented. But let's not romanticize her too quickly. The stories told about Semiramis are not just whispers of slander. They are drenched in gore. The same chronicles that crowned her a city builder also accused her of unspeakable cruelty. They claimed she not only seduced men, but destroyed them, using pleasure as a trap. Her name was weaponized as shorthand for unrestrained female sexuality, the kind that terrified ancient male chroniclers. Imagine if every rumor about a powerful modern woman, every sexist tabloid headline, every smear campaign, every paranoid whisper were rolled into one monstrous caricature. That's Semiramis, the perfect scapegoat. A queen turned demon remembered not as a ruler, but as a warning. And yet, that's why she fascinates us. Because if even half the stories were true, then she was one of the most audacious rulers the ancient world had ever seen. And if none of them were true, then what we're left with is just as disturbing. The ultimate smear campaign, so powerful it still echoes across history. Either way, the tale of Semiramis is no ordinary legend. It is the weaponized memory of a woman who threatened the natural order. But the stories they told about her weren't just flattering, they were terrifying. It begins in the dark. A whispered rumor carried through the courts of Mesopotamia, spreading like a sickness. They said that to be summoned to Semiramis's bed was not an honor, it was a death sentence. Because the queen, the great empress of Babylon, was no ordinary lover, she was an executioner in silk sheets. According to the most scandalous ancient accounts, Semiramis demanded men by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds. Soldiers, slaves, captured princes, it didn't matter. They were led into her bedchamber like contestants on a game show, with only one prize, one night with the queen. But there was a catch. At dawn, their heads were separated from their bodies. No second chances, no repeat performances. Imagine the terror. Imagine lying beside the most powerful woman in the world, knowing every kiss, every caress, every whispered word of seduction was also the signing of your death warrant. A night of ecstasy followed by a dawn of butchery, pleasure weaponized into power. Was it true, or was it the ancient world's version of a smear campaign, the tabloids of history painting a queen as a man-eating monster? That uncertainty is the real horror. Because whether or not she did it, enough people believed it to etch it permanently into her legend. And belief alone can kill reputations. But let's pause for a moment. Why invent such a story? Because nothing terrifies patriarchal societies more than a woman who cannot be controlled, especially in the bedroom. Sex was supposed to be the arena where men dominated and women obeyed. But here was Semiramis, flipping the script. She wasn't the vulnerable one, she was the predator. She turned intimacy into execution. And the chroniclers, mostly men, responded by turning her into a cautionary tale. Think about how this echoes today. Even in the 21st century, when powerful women rise, whispers spread, she slept her way to the top. She's a man-eater. The same tired accusations weaponized across millennia. Only for Semiramis, the gossip wasn't just whispered, it was drenched in blood. The imagery is grotesque. A queen using men like disposable playthings, burning through their lives in a single night. Like Tinder if every match came with a death sentence. Swipe right, sleep with the queen, die before breakfast, and as horrific as that sounds, it carried a twisted allure. After all, what greater proof of her dominance than the line of men still willing to risk it? For some, the fantasy of one night with Semiramis outweighed the certainty of death. But here's the deeper cruelty. This wasn't just about sex. This story branded her with something even more corrosive: unnaturalness. A woman wasn't supposed to enjoy sex on her terms. She wasn't supposed to crave it, demand it, control it by painting her as a sexual glutton. Ancient writers made her not just immoral but monstrous. She became an embodiment of chaos, too much appetite, too much pleasure, too much power. And yet, there's something undeniably fascinating in the horror. Because even if the story was fabricated, it reveals what terrified men the most. A queen who didn't need them, except as temporary fuel for her own satisfaction. To them, that was worse than tyranny. That was emasculation turned into empire. Picture it again. The dawn light spilling into the royal chamber, silk sheets stained with perfume, and outside the walls, the sound of swords being drawn, the men who had been gods for a night, reduced to corpses by morning. It is a scene designed to linger in the imagination, to sear itself into memory, and that's why the story survived. Because whether it happened or not, it captured the ultimate nightmare of male chroniclers. A woman who killed not with daggers or poison, but with desire. But make no mistake, this wasn't the end of the accusations. The bedroom was just one theater of cruelty in the myth of Semiramis. If her enemies claimed she destroyed men between the sheets, they also claimed she reshaped entire cities through lies, deception, and corruption. Because according to legend, her lust wasn't confined to the body. It infected stone, brick, and empire itself. And that was only the beginning of her cruelty. They say she built Babylon. They say the towering walls that defied armies and the hanging gardens that seduced kings were her creations. A queen, they claimed, who took the raw clay of Mesopotamia and molded it into the world's first great metropolis. And for centuries, people believed it. Semiramis, the master builder, the city maker, the founder of Babylon itself. But archaeology has a cruel way of cutting through legend. When the spades dug into Babylon's ruins, what they found wasn't the fingerprint of Semiramis. It was the mark of others. Kings like Hammurabi, rulers like Nebuchadnezzar. The city was far older, far larger, and far more complex than her myth could contain. The walls of Babylon, built long after she was supposedly gone. The gardens, more likely propaganda of their own. So why give the credit or the blame to her? Because the story was never about city planning. It was about branding. By tying her name to Babylon, later writers didn't just make her a queen, they made her the architect of sin itself. Babylon was remembered not as a city, but as a warning, a symbol of human pride, decadence, and doom. And if you wanted to paint a woman as the face of corruption, what better place to make her queen than Babylon? It's like pinning Wall Street's greed on a single woman and then writing her into every sermon, every scandal, every whispered curse for centuries. The irony burns. In reality, Semiramis may have had nothing to do with the city, but in myth, she became its soul, and not in a flattering way. Her alleged constructions were less about bricks and mortar, and more about constructing an identity. The chroniclers didn't want to remember her as a ruler who held power in a man's world. They wanted to make her the embodiment of excess, the seductress who didn't just rule men. She ruled the world they built, and she ruined it in the process. It's propaganda disguised as biography. Take a woman who dares to step outside her role and attach her to the most infamous city in human memory. Babylon, the whore of empires. Semiramis, the mother of Babylon. By the time Christian writers got their hands on her story, the connection was sealed. Revelation calls Babylon the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. They didn't have to name her directly. The shadow of Semiramis was already stitched into every word. Think about how deliberate that is. Imagine centuries from now, if the ruins of Las Vegas were blamed not on corporations, not on governments, not on greed, but on one woman, a convenient villain who becomes the mascot for sin. That's what happened here. It wasn't history, it was character assassination written in stone. And the cruelest twist? By remembering her as Babylon's founder, the legend ensured her immortality. She would never escape it. Every sermon condemning Babylon condemned her. Every reference to decadence dragged her back from the grave. She wasn't just a queen anymore. She was a mythological virus, spreading through cultures, infecting imaginations, and staining her name forever. But make no mistake, these stories were not memorials. They weren't meant to honor her achievements. They were meant to warp her image into something grotesque, something unforgettable, something that would echo through the ages, not as respect, but as revulsion. because the legends about her weren't meant to honor her. They were meant to damn her. She wasn't just remembered as a queen. She was remembered as the whore of civilization. By the time Christian writers took hold of her legend, Semiramis was no longer simply a ruler of Mesopotamia. She had been transformed into something darker, something obscene, the very embodiment of sexual corruption. In sermons and commentaries, she was whispered about as the original harlot, the mother of vice, the woman who supposedly spread prostitution across the earth like a plague. Revelation 17 paints a chilling picture. A woman, clothed in purple and scarlet, drunk on the blood of saints, her golden cup brimming with filth and abominations, and written on her forehead, a name, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. To most readers, that was a city, but to those steeped in the myths, that name pointed to Semiramis. She was Babylon's mother. She was the whore who birthed decadence itself. And here's the irony. This image wasn't carved from her deeds, but from her gender. Men in power could indulge in excess, corruption, and cruelty, and still be remembered as kings. But a woman who dared to wield authority, she was rewritten as a prostitute. It was the easiest slander, the oldest trick in the book. Label her a harlot, and suddenly her power becomes not leadership but seduction. Her influence becomes not strategy but sin. Think of it as ancient propaganda, the same way modern tabloids twist headlines about powerful women. A female CEO becomes a man-eater. A politician becomes a seductress. Their authority is stripped away and replaced with innuendo. For Semiramis, the stakes were even higher. They didn't just smear her reputation, they rewrote her into the origin story of humanity's downfall. The charge of prostitution carried layers of venom. It wasn't just about sex, it was about spiritual corruption. The accusation said, this woman didn't just ruin men's bodies, she ruined their souls. She didn't just lie in bed with kings, she lay with entire nations, seducing them into moral decay. She became the biblical archetype of temptation, the kind of figure preachers could invoke for centuries to terrify congregations into obedience. But peel back the layers, and you see the hypocrisy. Because while Semiramis was being painted as the universal harlot, the same societies accusing her were drenched in their own brothels, temples of sacred sex, and kings who paraded mistresses like trophies. Male lust was treated as natural, even celebrated. Female desire, or worse, female independence, was treated as evil. The double standard is almost laughable, if it weren't so sinister. The mother of harlots image also served another purpose. It stripped away Semiramis's humanity. She wasn't allowed to be complex, or flawed, or real. She became a caricature, a warning sign, a living moral panic. And once that image spread, it stuck. By the Middle Ages, she was a staple of church rhetoric, a cautionary tale used to keep women in line, to show what happens when femininity is allowed to run unchecked. But think about what that really means. It means one figure, whether real or mythical, was weaponized for over 2,000 years to control women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's power. Semiramis wasn't just a story. She was a tool to keep half of humanity chained to the idea that freedom equals corruption, that independence equals sin. And yet, even in her vilification, she became strangely immortal. The very slanders that were meant to bury her instead kept her alive, echoing across centuries in sermons, in paintings, in whispered tales of the queen who corrupted the world. She was remembered not for what she did, but for what men feared she represented. And if you think prostitution was the worst accusation thrown at her, think again, because the storytellers weren't finished. They wanted to push her beyond harlotry into realms even darker, even more grotesque. They accused her not just of lust, but of perversions that blurred the line between desire and horror. But wait until you hear how they accused her of incest and cannibalism. If being branded the mother of harlots wasn't enough, her enemies decided to drag her deeper into the pit. They accused Semiramis not just of lust, but of the most forbidden desires imaginable. The Whispers claimed she seduced her own son. Yes, according to the darkest versions of her legend, when her husband Ninus died, Semiramis didn't simply step into power, she demanded her son share more than the throne. He was supposed to be both heir and lover. To the chroniclers, this wasn't just scandal, it was the ultimate taboo, proof that she wasn't merely immoral, she was unnatural, inhuman, a creature who blurred bloodlines and corrupted the sacred bonds of family. The story goes further. Some accounts claim she tried to elevate herself into divinity, demanding her son and subjects worship her as a living goddess. Imagine the optics. A woman not content with power on earth, reaching for the heavens themselves, insisting mortals bow down to her flesh. To the ancient world, this wasn't ambition, it was blasphemy. And to brand her as both incestuous and divine was to paint her as a figure of total corruption, a queen who devoured the very structures of family and faith. But why these particular accusations? Because they stick. Even today, accusations of incest or abuse carry an almost nuclear level of stigma. They disgust, they horrify, they silence nuance. For Semiramis's enemies, it was the perfect weapon. They could reduce her entire reign to a single vile image, a mother entwined with her son, turning the sacred into the profane. And yet the smear campaign didn't stop there. Some versions of the legend accuse her of cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism, allegedly feasting on the flesh of her lovers or enemies as though desire alone wasn't enough. The woman who once demanded hundreds of men in her bed was now said to consume their very bodies, turning sex into slaughter, hunger into horror. It's the kind of story designed not to be believed, but to be remembered. Once you hear it, you can't shake it. Think about the psychology behind this. A powerful woman is threatening, but a woman who consumes men, literally or symbolically, is monstrous. She becomes not just dangerous, but apocalyptic. The ancients painted her as the nightmare, lurking at the edge of civilization. A queen who blurs the lines between mother and lover, ruler and goddess, bedchamber and butcher's table. And the hypocrisy is staggering. Male rulers throughout history took child brides, slept with their daughters-in-law, claimed divine bloodlines, even declared themselves living gods. Yet their reputations survived. Semiramis, she was transformed into a grotesque parable, proof that women in power couldn't just be dangerous, they had to be perverse. This is how the legend spiraled. Every retelling escalated the accusations from lust to prostitution, from prostitution to incest, from incest to cannibalism. Each step pushing her further from human, deeper into the realm of nightmare, and every layer was soaked with symbolism. If Babylon was the city of sin, then its queen had to be the high priestess of corruption, guilty of every horror the human imagination could conjure. Picture the effect on an ancient audience. To hear of Semiramis wasn't just to hear of a ruler, it was to stare into a mirror of everything society feared. She was sex without limits, family without purity, power without restraint. A woman whose very existence was a form of betrayal, betrayal of husband, son, subjects, even of humanity itself. And like every horror story, it had to end in blood. Because when you build a myth this monstrous, you can't let the villain fade quietly. You have to kill her in a way that matches the legend. And so the storytellers gave her not one death, but two, each one more shocking than the last. And that is where her nightmare takes its final twisted turn. For a queen smeared as prostitute, sorceress, and cannibal, an ordinary death would never do. The storytellers knew that someone like Semiramis couldn't just fade into old age, wheezing out her final breath. No, a legend like hers demanded a death to match the nightmare, and so they gave her two. The first ending is brutal, soaked in betrayal. In this version, her son, tired of being her puppet or perhaps disgusted by the rumors of incest, rose up against her. The boy she had supposedly taken as both heir and lover turned his sword against her, murdering the very woman who birthed him. The symbolism is stark, the natural order restoring itself through blood. The son kills the mother, purity avenges corruption, and the monster is slain. It's a neat moral ending, too neat. But other versions couldn't resist a more spectacular finale. They claimed Semiramis didn't die at all. Instead, she transformed into a dove and ascended to the heavens, vanishing into the sky like some unholy spirit. One moment, a queen drenched in silk and scandal; the next, a bird disappearing into the clouds, leaving her enemies gaping at the impossible. In this telling, she wasn't punished. She escaped. She slipped free of human judgment and became something untouchable, immortal in myth. Two deaths, one soaked in vengeance, one in transcendence, and both tell us more about the people spreading the tales than about Semiramis herself. To her enemies, she was too dangerous to leave unresolved. If she died by her son's hand, it was a morality play, a warning that female ambition ends in family betrayal. If she flew away as a dove, it was a different kind of horror. She wasn't gone, she was everywhere, a ghostly presence that still haunted the living. Either way, her story ends, not with closure, but with contagion, because myths like this don't die, they spread. The Greeks carried her name into their histories. The Romans folded her into their gossip about the East. Christian preachers recycled her into their sermons, and each retelling twisted the knife further, ensuring she lived on not as a queen, but as a nightmare. And here's the irony. By giving her two deaths, they made her immortal. Every time she was killed, she was reborn in another version of the story. Like a horror movie villain who refuses to stay buried. She clawed her way back into cultural memory again and again. Was she assassinated? Did she ascend as a goddess? Did she simply vanish? The uncertainty is the point. She becomes less a person and more a specter, a mythic stain that refuses to wash away. Think about it. Most ancient queens are footnotes in dusty records. But Semiramis, she has two contradictory deaths, endless rumors, and a legacy that still clings to her name 3,000 years later. That's not history, that's obsession. That's fear made immortal. But of course, death was not the end of her punishment. If her enemies couldn't kill her body, they killed her memory. They weaponized her legend, turned her into the eternal mascot for corruption, the eternal warning against female power. Her story didn't end with blood or feathers. It metastasized, infecting every generation that repeated it. And that's why, centuries after her supposed reign, she was still invoked from pulpits, still painted in lurid colors by historians, still whispered about as the root of every sin. Her second death wasn't really a death at all. It was a rebirth. But the final twist is even darker. Semiramis may have never lived as they described her, but her shadow would go on to outlive empires. Legends die, empires crumble, names fade into dust. But Semiramis, she refused to vanish. Or rather, her enemies refused to let her vanish. They kept her alive, not as a ruler, not as a builder, not even as a human being, but as a monster. In Renaissance paintings, she reappeared as a half-naked temptress, her gaze luring men into ruin. In medieval sermons, she was invoked as the harlot who corrupted the world. In the fevered imagination of conspiracy theorists, she morphed into the secret architect of paganism, the dark mother lurking behind every idol, every ritual, every sin. Even today, whispers of Semiramis appear in corners of the internet, where every institution is accused of ancient corruption. She has become eternal, not through truth, but through vilification. And that's the bitter irony. The real Semiramis, if she existed at all, was likely no more than a powerful Assyrian queen, perhaps the regent Semiramis, who ruled briefly in the 9th century BCE. Her true deeds are mostly lost. What survived was the smear campaign, polished and repeated until it gleamed like scripture. She wasn't remembered for governing an empire or commanding armies. She was remembered as the woman who slept with hundreds, killed them all, built a city of sin, prostituted the world, seduced her son, ate her lovers, and then either died by her child's hand or fled into the sky, a carnival of horrors, masquerading as biography. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. The myth of Semiramis became more powerful than any reality could have been. She was weaponized across centuries as the ultimate example of what happens when women take power. Too ambitious? You're a harlot. Too independent? You're corrupt. Too commanding? You're a monster. Think of how familiar that pattern sounds. Even now, when a woman rises to power, the attacks are rarely about policy. They're about character, about her body, her sexuality, her family. The smear is the weapon. For Semiramis it was turned up to 11, until her humanity was stripped away entirely. She wasn't just flawed, she was the mother of every sin. And yet, there's something hauntingly magnetic about her legend. Because beneath the propaganda you can glimpse the shadow of the truth. There must have been something about her, her presence, her command, her survival, that terrified men so deeply they felt the need to invent centuries of slander just to bury her. You don't build a myth like Semiramis around nothing. Somewhere at the root there was a woman who refused to obey, and history punished her by immortalizing her as a demon. But look closer, and the punishment reveals itself as projection. Every horror attributed to her lust, greed, betrayal, cruelty was already rampant among kings. Male rulers slept with countless women, declared themselves gods, betrayed their families, slaughtered their subjects, yet their legacies were marble statues and epic poems. Semiramis, she got a scarlet letter branded across eternity. This is the final twist of her story. She didn't just die twice. She's been dying for 3,000 years, killed over and over again by the stories told about her. Each retelling is another execution, another beheading at dawn, another betrayal by men who couldn't allow her to be remembered as human. And yet she still lives. Her name still stirs whispers. Her legend still fascinates. And in that survival there's a strange kind of victory. She was supposed to be erased, turned into nothing more than a cautionary tale. Instead, she became unforgettable, the queen who turned into a monster, the monster who refused to disappear. So what does her story tell us? That history is not just about what happened, it's about who controls the story. Semiramis may not have slept with 100 men. She may not have built Babylon. She may not have devoured her son, but she was devoured by propaganda, by fear, by the insecurities of the men who wrote her legend. And that should make us pause. Because if the mother of Babylon is nothing more than a myth built on lies and slander, how many other stories of history are just the same? How many lives have been rewritten into monsters just to keep the powerful safe? In the end, Semiramis may not tell us much about one queen, but she tells us everything about the men who feared her. And that fear still echoes.